A shipping manifest fragment survives in the Buenos Aires Customs Archive. March 1908. 27 wooden crates listed as geological specimens and survey equipment, arriving from Antarctic waters aboard a French-flagged vessel, chartered through a London banking subsidiary. The crates weighed 14 tons total. That is far beyond what rock samples should require. The destination address was a Rothschild family warehouse in Suffolk, London. That warehouse was demolished in 1911. Its records were lost in what the insurance claim described as a routine fire. Here is the contradiction that opens everything. Rothschild Island was not officially named until 1909, when Jean-Baptiste Charcot's French Antarctic expedition reached the Antarctic peninsula and honoured the family that funded his voyage. But the 1908 manifest does not list the origin as coordinates or as unnamed territory. It references Rothschild staging point by name, 1 year before the public naming, 1 year before the official discovery. The question is simple and destabilizing. How do you remove something from a place that does not officially have your name on it yet? The accepted story positions this as standard European exploration culture. A wealthy banking family funds a scientific expedition. The expedition maps new territory. The explorers honour their patron by naming a geographical feature after them. Rothschild Island is described in early expedition literature as small, rocky, strategically unimportant. It sits in the Antarctic Peninsula region among dozens of similar islands. The arrangement looks like routine patronage, gentleman scientist tradition. Charcot gets funding. The Rothschilds get their name on a map. Nothing unusual is implied in any official record. But the banking ledgers tell a different story. Between 1903 and 1908, the Rothschild London office processed payments totalling £47,000. In today's currency, roughly $9.4 million. The payments went to shell companies registered in Montevideo and Valparaiso. The payment descriptions were listed as South Atlantic Mineral Assay, Cold Climate Engineering Trials, and Geological Verification Services. These payments predate any official Rothschild sponsorship of Antarctic exploration by 5 years. They were funding something in Antarctic waters long before they were publicly funding Antarctic exploration. Cross-reference the shell company addresses with the 1908 shipping records. 3 of the companies share the same registered address as the agent who handled the crate shipment. The fracture is now visible. The official narrative describes philanthropic patronage of science beginning in 1909. The financial records describe industrial operations beginning in 1903. That is a 6-year gap. During those 6 years, substantial capital flowed toward Antarctic mineral assessment and cold climate engineering. The language in the payment ledgers is not scientific, it is extractive. Mineral assay means determining ore quality and commercial viability. Engineering trials means testing equipment under operational conditions. Geological verification means confirming resource deposits exist in quantities worth pursuing. This is the language of industry, not discovery. Now look at what else was happening in 1908 globally. The year before, New Zealand formally claimed the Ross Dependency, a vast slice of Antarctic territory. The year after, Britain issued letters patent claiming Antarctic land on a scale no other nation had attempted. The year 1908 sits directly in the middle of the first Antarctic territorial scramble. But here is what changes the frame. Most claims during this period were symbolic, of flags planted, names declared, no infrastructure, no permanent presence, no physical extraction. The 14-ton crate shipment suggests something fundamentally different. Material transport on an industrial scale. The question shifts. What were they taking out, and why did it require that much weight capacity before territorial claims were formalized? Charcot's 1909 expedition route shows something strange. His ship approached Rothschild Island from an unusual angle, directly from the east. That is not the standard northern approach used by most expeditions navigating the Antarctic Peninsula. Navigation logs from the period show the northern route was preferred because it avoided pack ice and provided better shelter from prevailing winds. Charcot's eastern approach was harder, slower, and more exposed to weather, but it brought him directly to the island's eastern shore, where his published journals mention remains of a previous seasonal camp. He attributes the camp to sealers or whalers, but there are no sealing or whaling records for that specific island during that period. The sealing industry kept detailed logs of territorial operations because pelts were valuable commodities requiring accountability and licensing. Rothschild Island does not appear in any commercial sealing company's operational records between 1890 and 1910. The camp remains Charcot describes included iron fittings and timber framework. Those are not materials typical of temporary sealing operations, which relied on portable canvas shelters and minimal metal components to reduce weight during ship transport. Iron fittings suggest permanence. Timber framework suggests construction meant to last across seasons. These are traces of something more substantial than a brief commercial stopover. Charcot names the island for his expedition's sponsor in 1909, but the sponsor had already been there. The timing is what matters. The 1908 extraction happened during late Antarctic summer, February through March, the only navigational window before ice made approach impossible. The 1909 expedition arrived during the same seasonal window, but by then the crates were already in London. Whatever needed removing had been removed. What Charcot was doing was not discovery, it was formalization. He was placing the family name on something they had already accessed, surveyed, and extracted from. The public story could now begin. The private operation was already complete. Step back to see the larger pattern forming. Between 1903 and 1912, 5 different Antarctic locations received Rothschild-related names or direct financial backing. Rothschild Island is one. Mount Rothschild on the Antarctic Peninsula is another. 3 other coastal features in the region carry dedications to Rothschild family members or banking associates in expedition records. These are not randomly distributed across the continent. They form a rough semicircle around the Antarctic Peninsula's western coast. The arc spans roughly 400 kilometers of coastline. Cross-reference these locations with geological surveys conducted in the 1920s and 1930s. After early territorial claims had been established but before the Antarctic Treaty froze resource activity. That semicircle region contains the highest concentration of accessible coal deposits and metallic ore formations in Antarctica. Accessible meaning close to coastlines, not buried beneath miles of inland ice. Accessible meaning extractable with early 20th century industrial technology if territorial and environmental restrictions were not in place. The surveys identified substantial coal seams, copper deposits, and iron ore concentrations within 50 kilometers of the coast. These surveys were conducted by government geological offices, not private companies. The findings were published in technical journals that circulated only among mining industry specialists and colonial administrators. The widening realization becomes unavoidable. The 1908 extraction was not an isolated event. It was one visible moment in a multi-year positioning operation. The crates were not survey equipment returning home after a scientific mission. They were likely the first significant mineral samples removed from Antarctic territory before competing territorial claims could lock down access. The operation had a clear logic. Survey the region quietly through shell company funding. Identify valuable deposits using hired geologists and engineers. Extract representative samples during the narrow pre-claim window. Formalize territorial association through public expedition and naming conventions. Lock the geographic claim before other powers understand what the region contains. The pattern is methodical. First, private capital assesses the resource base without public attention. Second, physical samples confirm commercial viability. Third, public expeditions create the appearance of scientific discovery while establishing naming rights. Fourth, those naming rights support later territorial claims when governments formalize Antarctic policy. The official story describes exploration. The operational sequence describes prospecting. But here is what transforms the story from resource prospecting into something more coordinated. In 1911, 3 years after the crates arrived in London, a private geological conference was held at the Rothschild estate in Buckinghamshire, northwest of London. The attendee list is partially preserved in family papers archived at the Rothschild Foundation in London. The list includes representatives from the British Admiralty's Polar Navigation Division. It includes senior officers from the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later become British Petroleum. It includes executives from De Beers Consolidated Mines, the dominant diamond extraction and trading concern in southern Africa. There is no public record of what was discussed, no published minutes, no formal agenda, no newspaper coverage, no mention in any participants' published memoirs or official biographies. But within 18 months of that conference, Britain issued the most aggressive Antarctic territorial claim in history. The 1917 Letters Patent asserted British sovereignty over a massive wedge of the continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, encompassing the entire Antarctic peninsula and extending deep into the continental interior. And all three companies that attended the 1911 conference received significant exploration or extraction licenses in other remote regions during the same period. Anglo-Persian oil expanded aggressively into southern Persia's oil fields between 1912 and 1914, securing drilling rights that would define British petroleum strategy for decades. De Beers consolidated control over southern African diamond territories through a series of acquisitions and agreements formalised between 1911 and 1913. The British Admiralty updated its polar navigation protocols in 1912, authorised new icebreaker construction, and expanded its cold weather training programmes. Each of these developments required substantial capital investment and strategic planning. Each began within months of the Buckinghamshire Conference. The timing is too clean to be coincidental. The samples arrived in London in 1908. The private conference occurred in 1911. The territorial claim and industrial expansions followed in 1912 and 1913. The sequence suggests the samples proved something significant enough to require private coordination among imperial commercial interests, something valuable enough to justify Britain's sudden aggressive posture in Antarctic territorial politics, something that needed to be discussed quietly among resource extraction specialists, naval strategists and financial power before becoming part of public policy. The question that forces the next chapter is direct. What did the samples prove, and who else needed to know before the rest of the world caught up? Return to the 1908 manifest with new framing. The crates were listed as arriving in March, that is late Antarctic summer in the southern hemisphere, that is the extraction window, the only time Antarctic waters are navigable without icebreaker support. The ice retreats enough to allow approach. The weather stabilizes enough to permit landing operations. The window lasts 6 to 8 weeks. Then the ice returns and the continent becomes inaccessible until the next summer. But here is the logistical detail that matters. Chartering a vessel capable of Antarctic navigation in 1908 required 6 months minimum advance planning. Ice-strengthened hulls were rare. Captains with polar experience were expensive and selective about contracts. Provisions for cold weather operations required specialized suppliers. Insurance for Antarctic voyages carried premium rates that needed board approval from London underwriters. The operation was not opportunistic. It was scheduled, staffed and funded as a discrete industrial mission. Someone knew 6 months in advance exactly where the ship needed to go and exactly what needed to come back. Reframe the meaning now. This was not exploration that happened to find something. This was targeted extraction using exploration as cover. The distinction is essential. Exploration is open-ended. You go to see what is there. Extraction is closed loop. You go because you already know what is there and you need physical confirmation or samples for further analysis. The 1908 operation was extraction. The 1909 Charcot expedition was the cover story formalized after the fact. Now look at what happened to the information. Charcot's 1910 published expedition report mentions Rothschild Island in one paragraph. The description is brief and unremarkable. Small island, rocky composition, named in honor of expedition patron. No unusual features noted. But Charcot's private field journals tell a different story. These journals are archived at the French Geographical Society in Paris. They were partially digitized in the 1990s as part of a polar exploration documentation project. The private journals contain 11 pages of detailed observations about Rothschild Island. The published version removes specific content. Descriptions of mechanical debris found on the eastern shore. Sketches of the camp layout showing timber foundation posts arranged in a rectangular grid pattern. Notes on disturbed sediment patterns inconsistent with natural weathering. observations about metal fragments that appeared deliberately shaped rather than salvaged from shipwrecks. All of this material was in the private journals. None of it reached the published report. Someone edited what reached the public, not Charcot himself. The editing happened during the publication process. Cross-check the timeline. Charcot's expedition was funded by a consortium that included the same London banking network that processed the 1903 to 1908 Shell Company payments. The funding agreement gave consortium representatives review authority over expedition publications to protect proprietary geographical and commercial information, standard practice for privately funded expeditions during that era, but the effect was narrative control. They funded the removal operation, then they funded the official discovery expedition, then they controlled what the official discovery expedition could publish. The pattern is now clear. Operational phase, public phase, narrative phase. First, extract the samples quietly. Second, formalize the location through official expedition. Third, ensure the official account contains nothing that reveals the prior operation. The system worked because each phase appeared independent. The extraction looked like private surveying. The expedition looked like scientific discovery. The publication looked like routine academic documentation. Only the financial thread connects them. Only the timing reveals the coordination. Here is where the scale changes. After the 1903 to 1912 Antarctic scramble, major powers lose public interest in the continent for 50 years. The official explanation is economic, too expensive, too remote, scientifically unproductive. Public funding dries up, expeditions become rare. Antarctica drops out of imperial competition narratives. But look at what happens in the background during this quiet period. The 1920s see quiet bilateral agreements between Britain, France and Norway on Antarctic spheres of influence. These are not formalized as treaties. They are buried in diplomatic correspondence, archived in foreign ministry files, never announced publicly, never debated in parliaments. The agreements sketch out rough boundaries. Britain gets the Atlantic-facing quadrant. France gets advisory rights in adjacent territories. Norway gets recognition of claims along the opposite coast. The agreements are vague enough to avoid triggering international legal challenges, specific enough to signal mutual recognition among powers that were already there first. The 1930s see private mining companies conducting feasibility studies in sub-Antarctic islands. Shell, Anglo-Persian, and several smaller extraction firms send geologists to South Georgia, the South Sandwich Islands and other territories just north of the Antarctic convergence. The studies assess coal accessibility, ore concentrations and logistical costs for potential future operations. Most reports are classified as proprietary commercial information. Some are lost, others remain in corporate archives that restrict researcher access. The studies were never about immediate extraction. They were about understanding what would be required if and when territorial restrictions lifted. The 1940s see multiple nations conducting secret military exercises in Antarctic waters during World War II. Germany operated surface raiders and submarine refueling operations in remote southern ocean areas. Britain maintained covert weather stations on sub-Antarctic islands to monitor conditions affecting Atlantic convoy routes. The United States conducted cold weather equipment testing that was classified until the 1970s. Most operational records from this period remain partially redacted. The exercises were justified as wartime necessity, but they also served as reconnaissance, testing what was possible in Antarctic conditions, mapping what had changed since the early expeditions, assessing what new technology could access. The realization becomes unavoidable. The silence was not disinterest. It was controlled exclusion while key players assessed what was actually there and what would be required to access it at scale. The powers that extracted samples in the 1900s spent the next 50 years evaluating whether full-scale resource operations were technically feasible, economically viable, and politically manageable. The answer appears to have been yes on all three counts, which makes what happened next even more revealing. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959. 12 nations, Washington, D.C. The official story presents it as a landmark achievement in international cooperation, scientific collaboration, demilitarization, environmental protection, Cold War tensions channeled into peaceful coexistence, The treaty is celebrated as visionary diplomacy. But read Article 4 with the 1908 context in mind. Article 4 freezes all territorial claims without resolving them. Nations that claimed Antarctic territory before 1959 keep their claims, but no new claims can be made. No existing claims can be expanded, and critically, no existing claims can be enforced. The article creates legal suspended animation. Everyone keeps what they claimed. Nobody can act on what they claimed. Article 4 also bans resource extraction while allowing scientific research. The distinction matters. Scientific research requires no commercial licensing. Resource extraction requires claim recognition and international legal frameworks. By banning extraction but allowing research, the treaty ensures that knowledge about Antarctic resources can continue accumulating without triggering the territorial conflicts that would follow if extraction began. The treaty creates a 50-year moratorium on mining. That moratorium was later extended indefinitely in 1991 through the Protocol on Environmental Protection. The functional reading is now clear. The treaty locked the continent before competing claims could escalate into conflict. But it locked the continent in a state that preserved existing knowledge asymmetries. The nations that already knew what was there got to freeze the board before nations that did not know could catch up. Look at who drafted the treaty's key provisions. The United States State Department legal team led the drafting process during the 1958 preparatory conference. Britain provided historical territorial documentation to support the legal framework. That documentation included materials from early 20th century expeditions, Charcot expedition records, Scott expedition records, Shackleton expedition records. All the expeditions that occurred during the 1903 to 1912 positioning phase. France contributed geological survey data from early expeditions, data that was not published in academic journals, data that remained in government ministry files. The same three powers that were involved in the 1903 to 1912 period. The same three powers represented at the 1911 Buckinghamshire Conference. Britain, France, and the United States, which inherited British imperial intelligence networks and resource assessments after World War II. The treaty's most restrictive clause, Article 4, was proposed jointly by Britain and France, the two nations most deeply involved in early Antarctic operations, the two nations that funded both the private extraction missions and the public expeditions that followed. The question that clarifies motive is direct. Why would nations with the strongest territorial claims agree to freeze those claims unless they were protecting something more valuable than immediate access? The answer is strategic patience. If you already know what is there and you know competing powers do not, freezing the board preserves your advantage. When extraction technology advances enough, or when geopolitical conditions shift enough to make Antarctic operations viable, the nations with existing knowledge can move faster than nations starting from zero. The treaty does not prevent future access. It prevents chaotic competition for access, while technology and politics catch up to what early surveys already proved. Put the full case together plainly. Between 1903 and 1908, private capital funded resource assessment in Antarctic waters using shell companies and hired specialists. In 1908, physical extraction occurred, 14 tons of material removed during the narrow navigational window, shipped to London, received at a warehouse that burned 3 years later. In 1909, a public expedition formalised the location through official naming and published reports that omitted key observations. In 1911, a private conference brought together resource extraction firms, naval strategists and banking interests. Within 18 months, Britain issued aggressive territorial claims and the attending firms expanded operations in other remote regions. Between 1920 and 1950, a quiet period followed. Publicly, interest declined. Privately, bilateral agreements sketched spheres of influence. Feasibility studies assessed extraction logistics. Military exercises tested operational capacity in polar conditions. In 1959, a treaty froze the continent. It banned extraction. It froze claims without resolving them. It created legal architecture that preserved information asymmetries. The treaty was drafted by the same powers involved in early operations, proposed by the nations that funded early extraction and early expeditions. The systemic function becomes clear. The Antarctic Treaty did not prevent colonization. It prevented competition among the powers that already knew what was there. It turned a potential resource war into a managed exclusion zone. It bought time for technology to advance, time for geopolitical conditions to stabilize, time for the powers with early knowledge to maintain their advantage while appearing to champion international cooperation and environmental protection. The 1908 manifest exists. The crates were real. The banking records show the payments. The pre-expedition funding happened. Charcot's edited journals prove narrative control. Someone chose what to publish. Someone chose what to remove. But the content of the crates remains unknown. The 1911 conference minutes are not public. The sample's composition is unconfirmed. The feasibility studies from the 1930s are lost or restricted. The military exercise records from the 1940s remain partially redacted. What this means is straightforward. The operational pattern is documented. The strategic timing is clear. The institutional coordination is traceable through financial records, expedition funding, treaty drafting, and territorial claim sequences. But the specific resource findings remain locked in private archives or lost to deliberate destruction. The case does not require knowing exactly what the samples proved. It only requires seeing that something valuable enough to extract, conceal, and protect through treaty architecture was found. Return to the 1908 shipping manifest. 27 crates from an island that did not have a name yet. At the time, it looked like routine expedition logistics, geological specimens returning home, survey equipment being demobilized, nothing unusual. Now, seen through the pattern, it was the moment when Antarctica stopped being a blank map and became a managed asset. The crates were not just samples, they were proof of concept, proof that Antarctic resources were accessible enough to extract with early 20th century technology. Proof valuable enough to justify 50 years of quiet territorial positioning. Proof threatening enough to require a treaty that would freeze claims before extraction technology advanced further and before competing powers could mount their own assessment operations. The final observation is simple. When something is important enough to remove before it is officially discovered, and important enough to lock behind a treaty before it is officially confirmed, the question is not whether it was valuable. The question is who still knows where it is and what they are waiting for.